Hi guys, so today I will be reading the second part of the first chapter of Twilight, and immediately I want to say that I'm recording this intro after I already had recorded my reading part, so just a little disclaimer that my voice there was a little bit hoarse and I was just not confident overall, but I still decided that I will post it and not re-record. So I hope that some of you will still enjoy it, and I will try to get better with my next videos in the series. So I wish you a great night if you are trying to sleep, and let's get to the reading.
The rest of the morning passed in about the same fashion. My trigonometry teacher, Mr. Warner, who I would have hated anyway just because of the subject he taught, was the only one who made me stand in front of the class and introduce myself. I stammered, blushed, and tripped over my own boots on the way to my seat. After 2 classes, I started to recognize several of the faces in each class. There was always someone braver than the others who would introduce themselves and ask me questions about how I was liking forks. I tried to be diplomatic, but mostly I just lied a lot. At least I never needed the map. One girl sat next to me in both Greek and Spanish, and she walked with me to the cafeteria for lunch. She was tiny, several inches shorter than my 5 feet 4 inches, but her wildly curly dark hair made up a lot of the difference between our heights. I couldn't remember her name, so I smiled and nodded as she prattled about the teachers and classes. I didn't try to keep up. We sat at the end of a full table with several of her friends, who she introduced to me. I forgot all their names as soon as she spoke them. They seemed impressed by her bravery in speaking to me. The boy from English, Eric, waved at me from across the room. It was there, sitting in the lunchroom, trying to make conversation with 7 curious strangers, that I first saw them. They were sitting in the corner of the cafeteria, as far away from where I sat as possible in the long room. There were 5 of them. They weren't talking and they weren't eating, so they each had a tray of untouched food in front of them. They weren't gawking at me like most of the other students, so it was safe to stare at them without fear of meeting an excessively interested pair of eyes. But it was none of these things that caught and held my attention. They didn't look anything alike. Of the three boys, one was big and muscled like a serious weightlifter with dark curly hair. Another was taller, leaner, but still muscular, and honey blonde. The last was lanky, less bulky, with untidy bronze-colored hair. He was more boyish than the others, who looked like they could be in college or even teachers here rather than students. The girls were opposites. The tall one was statuesque. She had a beautiful figure, the kind you saw on the cover of the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, the kind that made every girl around her take a hit on her self-esteem just by being in the same room. Her hair was golden, gently waving to the middle of her back. The short girl was pixie-like, thin in the extreme with small features. Her hair was deep black, cropped short, and pointing in every direction. And yet they were all exactly alike. Every one of them was chalky pale, the palest of all the students living in this sunless town, paler than me, the albino. They all had very dark eyes despite the range in hair tones. They also had dark shadows under those eyes, purplish, bruise-like shadows, as if they were all suffering from a sleepless night or almost done recovering from a broken nose. Though their noses, all their features were straight, perfect, angular. But all this is not why I couldn't look away. I stared because their faces, so different, so similar, were all devastatingly, inhumanly beautiful. They were faces you never expected to see, except perhaps on the airbrushed pages of a fashion magazine, or painted by an old master as the face of an angel. It was hard to decide who was the most beautiful, maybe the perfect blonde girl or the bronze-haired boy. They were all looking away from each other, away from the other students, away from anything in particular, as far as I could tell. As I watched the small girl rose with her tray, an open soda and bit an apple, and walked away with a quick, graceful lope that belonged on the wrong way. I watched, amazed at her little dancer's step, till she dumped her tray and glided through the back door faster than I would have thought possible. My eyes darted back to the others, who sat unchanging. Who are they? I asked the girl from my Spanish class, whose name I had forgotten. As she looked up to see who I meant, though already knowing probably from my tone, suddenly he looked at her, the thinner one, the boyish one, the youngest perhaps. He looked at my neighbor for just a fraction of a second, and then his dark eyes flickered to mine. He looked away quickly, more quickly than I could, more quickly than I could. though in a flash of embarrassment I dropped my eyes at once. In that brief flash of a glance, his face held nothing of interest. It was as if he had called his name and he had looked up in involuntary response, already having decided not to answer. My neighbor giggled in embarrassment, looking at the table like I did. That's uh, that's Edward and Emmett Cohen, and Rosalie and Jasper Hale. The one, the one who left was Alice Cohen. They all lived together with Dr. Cohen and his wife. She said this under her breath. I glanced sideways at the beautiful boy who was looking at his tray now, picking a bagel to pieces with long, pale fingers. His mouth was moving very quickly, his perfect lips barely opening. The other three still looked away, and yet I felt he was speaking quietly to them. Strange, unpopular names, I thought. The kinds of names grandparents had, but maybe that was in vogue here. Small town names. I finally remembered that my neighbor was called Jessica, a perfectly common name. There were two girls named Jessica in my history class back home. They are very nice looking. I struggled with a conspicuous understatement. Yes, Jessica agreed with another giggle. They are all together though. Emmett and Rosalie and Jasper and Alice. And they live together. Her voice held all the shock and condemnation of the small town. I thought critically. But if I was being honest, I had to admit that in Phoenix, it would cause gossip. Which ones are the Coens? I asked. They don't look related. Or they're not. Dr. Cohen is really young, in his 20s or early 30s. They're all adopted. The Hales brother, brother and sister, twins, the blondes, and their foster children. They look a little old for foster children. They are now Jasper and Rosalie are both 18. But they have been with Mrs. Cohen since they were 8. She is their aunt or something like that. That's really kind of nice for them to take care of all those kids like that when they're so young and everything. I guess so, Jessica admitted reluctantly, and I got the impression that she didn't like the doctor and his wife for some reason. With the glances she was throwing at their adopted children, I would presume the reason was jealousy. I think that Mrs. Cohen can't have any kids, so she added, as if that lessened their kindness. Throughout all this conversation, my eyes flickered again and again to the table where the strange family sat. They continued to look at the walls and nodded. Have they always lived in Forks? I asked. Surely I would have noticed them on one of my summers here. No, she said in a voice that implied it should be obvious even to a new arrival like me. They just moved down 2 years ago from somewhere in Alaska. I felt a surge of pity and relief. Pity because, as beautiful as they were outsiders, clearly not accepted. Relief that I wasn't the only newcomer here, and certainly not the most interesting by any standard. As I examined them, the youngest one of the Collins looked up and met my gaze, this time with evident curiosity in his expression. As I looked swiftly away, it seemed to me that his glance held some kind of unmet expectation. Which one is the boy with the reddish brown hair? I asked. I picked at him from the corner of my eye, and he was still staring at me, but not gawking, like the other students had today. He had a slightly frustrated expression. I looked down again. That's Edward. He is gorgeous, of course, but don't waste your time. He doesn't date. Apparently, none of the girls here are good looking enough for him. She sniffed. A clear case of sour grapes. I wondered when he had turned her down. I bit my lip to hide my smile. Then I glanced at him again. His face was turned away, but I thought his cheeks appeared lifted, as he were smiling too. After a few more minutes, the four of them left the table together. They all were noticeably graceful, even the big brawny one. It was unsettling to watch. The one named Edward didn't look at me again. I sat at the table with Jessica and her friends longer than I would have if I had been sitting alone. I was anxious not to be late for class on my first day. One of my new acquaintances, who considerately reminded me that her name was Angela, had biology too with me next hour. We walked to class together in silence. She was shy too. When we entered the classroom, Angela went to sit at a black-topped lab table, exactly like the ones I was used to. She already had a neighbor. In fact, all the tables were filled but one. Next to the center aisle, I recognized Edward Cullen by his unusual hair, sitting next to that single open seat. As I walked down the aisle to introduce myself to the teacher and get my slip signed, I was watching him surreptitiously. Just as I passed, he suddenly went rigid in his seat. He stared at me again, meeting my eyes with the strangest expression on his face. It was hostile, furious. I looked away quickly, shocked, going red again. I stumbled over a book in the walkway and had to catch myself on the edge of a table. The girl sitting there giggled. I had noticed that his eyes were black, coal black. Mr. Banner signed my slip and handed me a book with no nonsense about introductions. I could tell we were going. I could tell we were going to get along. Of course, he had no choice but to send me to the one open seat in the middle of the room. I kept my eyes down as I went to sit by him, bewildered by the antagonistic stare he had given me. I didn't look up as I set my book on the table and took my seat, but I saw his posture change from the corner of my eye. He was leaning away from me, sitting on the extreme edge of his chair and averting his face like he smells something bad. Uh, inconspicuously, uh, I sniffed my hair. It smelled like strawberries, the scent of my favorite shampoo. It seemed an innocent enough odor. I let my hair fall over. I let my hair fall over my right shoulder, making a dark curtain between us, and tried to pay attention to the teacher. Unfortunately, the lecture was on cellular anatomy, something I had already studied. I took notes carefully anyway, always looking down. I couldn't stop myself from peeking occasionally through the screen of my hair at the strange boy next to me. During the whole class, he never relaxed his stiff position on the edge of his chair, sitting as far from me as possible. I could see his hand on his left leg was clenched into a fist, tendons standing out under his pale skin. This too he never relaxed. He had the long sleeves of his white shirt pushed up to his elbows, and his forearm was surprisingly hard and muscular beneath his light skin. He wasn't nearly as slight as he had looked next to his burly brother. The class seemed to drag on longer than the others. Was it because the day was finally coming to a close, or because I was waiting for his tight fist to loosen? It never did. He continued to sit so still. It looked like he wasn't breathing. What was wrong with him? Was this his normal behavior? I questioned my judgment on Jessica's bitterness at lunch today. Maybe she was not as resentful as I had thought. It couldn't have uh, anything to do with me. He didn't know me from Eve. I picked up at him one more time and regretted it. He was glaring down at me again, his black eyes full of revulsion. As I flinched away from him, shrinking against my chair, the phrase, if looks could kill, suddenly ran through my mind. At that moment the bell rang loudly, making me jump, and Edward Cullen was out of his seat. Fluidly, He rose fluidly. He rose. He was much taller than I had thought. His back to me, and he was out the door before anyone else was out of their seat. I sat frozen in my seat, staring blankly after him. He was so mean, it wasn't fair. I began gathering up my things slowly, trying to block the anger that filled me. For fear my eyes would tear up. For some reason, my temper was hand-wired to my tear ducts. I usually cried when I was angry, a humiliating tendency. "Aren't you Isabel Swan?" a male voice asked. I looked up to see a cute, baby-faced boy. His pale, blonde hair carefully gelled into orderly spikes, smiling at me in a friendly way. He obviously didn't think I smelled bad. Bella, I corrected him with a smile. "I'm Mike." "Hi, Mike. Do you need any help finding your next class?" "I'm headed to the gym, actually. I think I can find it." That's my next class too." He seemed thrilled, though it wasn't that big of a coincidence in a school this small. We walked to class together. He was a chatterer. He supplied most of the conversation, which made it easier for me. He had lived in California till he was done, so he knew how I felt about the sun. It turned out he was in my English class also. He was the nicest person I had met today, but as we were entering the gym, he asked, "So, did you stab Edward Cullen with a pencil or what?" I have never seen him act like that. I cringed, so I wasn't the only one who had noticed, and apparently that wasn't Edward Cullen's usual behavior. I decided to play dumb. "Was that the boy I sat next to in biology?" I asked artlessly. Yes," he said. He looked like he was in pain or something. I don't know," I responded. I never spoke to him. He's a weird guy," Mike lingered. He's a weird guy. Mike lingered by me instead of heading to the dressing room. "If I were lucky enough to sit by you, I would have talked to you." I smiled at him before walking through the girls' locker room door. He was friendly and clearly admiring, but it wasn't enough to ease my irritation. The gym teacher, Coach Clapp, found me a uniform but didn't make me dress down for today's class. At home, only 2 years of PE were required. Here, PE was mandatory all 4 years. Forks was literally my personal hell on earth. I watched 4 volleyball games running simultaneously, remembering how many injuries I have sustained and inflicted playing volleyball. I felt faintly nauseated. Yeah. The final bell rang at last. I walked slowly to the office to turn my paperwork The rain had drifted away, but the wind was strong and colder. I wrapped my arms around myself. When I walked into the warm office, I almost turned around and walked back out. Edward Cullen stood at the desk in front of me. I recognized again that uh, tousled bronze hair. He didn't appear um, to notice the sound of my entrance. I stood pressed against the back wall, waiting for the receptionist to be free. He was arguing with her in a low, attractive voice. I quickly picked up the gist of the argument. He was trying to trade from 6-hour biology to any other time. I just couldn't believe that this was about me. It had to be something else, something that happened before I entered the biology room. The look on his face must have been about another aggravation entirely. It was impossible that the stranger could take such a sudden, intense dislike to me. The door opened again, and the cold wind suddenly gusted through the room, rustling the papers on the desk, swirling my hair around my face. The girl who came in barely stepped to the desk, placed a note in the wire basket, and walked out again. But Edward Cullen's back stiffened, and he turned slowly to glare at me. His face was absurdly handsome, with piercing, hate-filled eyes. For an instant, I felt a thrill of genuine fear, raising the hair on my arms. The look only lasted a second, but it chilled me more than the freezing wind. He turned back to the receptionist. "Never mind then," he said hastily, in a voice like velvet. "I can see that it's impossible. Thank you so much for your help." And he turned on his heel without another look at me, and disappeared out the door. I went meekly to the desk, my face white for once instead of red. I handed her the signed slip. "How did your first day go, dear?" the receptionist asked maternally. Fine," I lied my voice weak. She didn't look convinced. When I got to the truck, it was almost the last car in the lot. It seemed like a heaven, a haven. Already the closest thing to home I had in this damp green hole. I sat inside for a while, just staring out the windshield blankly. But soon I was cold enough to need the heater, so I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. I headed back to Charlie's house, fighting tears the whole way there.